Welcome back to a series of talks on the spirituality of Saint Thérèse of Child Jesus. The topic of our discussion for today is the way of spiritual childhood. It is only 3 months before her death, that is on June 3rd, 1897, while Saint Thérèse began to write the manuscript C, that she told about the discovery of our little way. She called this way as a way that which is very straight, very short, and totally new. In fact, Thérèse had to devote more than 7 long years of her religious life to come to the understanding of this new way. And we are blessed because it is through that clarity of understanding today we have a clear, very straight, very short, and totally new little way. But the question before us is, what is that little way? How did Saint Thérèse come to know this little way? As a preliminary thought, let us see what the heads of the Catholic Church had to say about this little way. Pope Pius XII explains this little way when he says, "It is the same gospel, the heart of the gospel that Thérèse had rediscovered, but with so much of charm and freshness." John Paul II, while visiting Lisieux, said, "Of Thérèse one can say with conviction that the Spirit of God enabled her heart to reveal directly to the people of our times the fundamental mystery, the reality of the gospel. The grace of having truly received a spirit of adoption which makes us cry, Abba, Father." At least for these two popes, then, Therese's little way is the expression of the gospel lived out by Thérèse in modern times. In other words, the little way is the practical way that Saint Thérèse had discovered and handed over to the Catholic Church to live out the gospel in our everyday lives. If the little way is the expressive appropriation of the gospel itself, then by living out this little way, we are able to build our lives of the gospels. It would be, therefore, opportune to go into the details of this little way. Our second question is, what would be the components, therefore, of this little way? I would accommodate 4 fundamental components as the foundations of this little way, as little Thérèse would have loved that we understand as such. They are, number 1, love. Love as the only ideal and the only way. Number 2, life of abandonment, living out a life mirroring the will of the Father. Number 3, unconditional confidence, manifestation and acceptance of one's own weakness, and the exaltation of divine mercy in one's life. And the 4th one, the little way itself, the joy of being oneself totally in the arms of Jesus. Let us go one by one. The first one, love, the only ideal and the only way. First and foremost, it is important for us to understand that for Thérèse, the awareness of the primacy of love as the only ideal and only way was only gradual and slowly evolving. Maybe for an academic purpose, we are even able to divide this gradual understanding by Thérèse into 2 phases. One, from the time of her childhood and the initial years of her religious life. This phase can be summarized with her conviction as, "He loved me first, and now I will love him unto my death." And the second one is a more mature, fundamentally authentic understanding of our love for God. It was a slow but gradual realization that she is no match with the divine love and that she cannot reciprocate divine love equally because of her own finitude as a human being. This realization brings into her total dependency, a right understanding of divine mercy, and finally, the need of total abandonment in the hands of God in total confidence. God had bestowed upon Thérèse the greatest treasure of her life, the treasure that was within. It was the flame of love in her heart. She was a person with great love and a great heart. And from her childhood, she could look back and see how she was able to love both God and humanity unconditionally. Speaking about her childhood days, she says, I loved the good Lord more and more. I often gave my heart to Him. I did my best to please Jesus in all my actions and was very careful never to offend Him. The day before her entry into Carmel, she affirms, I want to give myself totally to Him. I want to live no longer but for Him. In Carmel, at last she thought that would be able to love Jesus according to her unlimited dreams. This is why the desert of Carmel ravished her heart. It returned to the essential. It hid a presence. And for Thérèse, the generous one, each sacrifice became a word of love, a smile, a flower to give, a very short time beforehand, while still living in the world, she had made up her mind to give to Jesus 1,000 proofs of my love, as she calls it. In fact, Thérèse approached her Carmelite life with the firm resolution to realize her ideal of sanctity, come what may. I want to be a saint. I'm not perfect, but want to become perfect. To become a great saint was her theme song. Her Lord does not want to set any limit to her sanctity. The price would never be too high. Jesus is asking all, as much as He can ask from the greatest saints. And she underlined this word, all, respectively, 2, 3, and 5 times. In fact, Thérèse wanted to break the world record for loving God. I would so much like to love Him more than He has ever been loved. She would love Him to folly, with passion, to infinity. She was really describing herself when she wrote to Celine. Jesus' love for Celine can be understood only by Jesus. Jesus has done foolish things for Celine. Now let Celine do foolish things for Jesus. However, this attitude of loving God passionately and unto folly changes gradually. She comes to a realization that given her human limitations, she cannot reciprocate divine love with equal intent. A river, for example, however great it may be, cannot match up with the ocean and its water. So too the human soul, however great and holy may be, our love for God, but is still a total mismatch compared to His love for us. She comes to a realization that even to love God unconditionally, one requires His grace. We can't grow in the love of God unless God draws us unto Himself. Therefore, Thérèse now strongly grows into the attitude of surrender, abandonment, and learns to put her complete trust on Him alone in confidence. She exclaims, one day I hope that you, the adorable eagle, will come to fetch me, your little bird, and ascending with it to the furnace of love, you will plunge it for all eternity into the burning abyss of this love to which it has offered itself as victim. This attitude is further expressed in her poems. Just to give a glimpse of a few examples. The spirit of love sets me aflame with this fire. Flame of love, consume me unceasingly. Deign to set me aflame with your fire. At a voice, my delighted soul is set aflame with the fire of love. Even in our personal prayers, we can see the same attitude of submission and abandonment. This is my prayer. I ask Jesus to draw me into the flame of his love, to unite me so closely to him that he'll live and act in me. That brought her to the second aspect of her realization, abandonment, mirroring the will of the Father. This gradual awareness of her finitude and the magnanimity of divine love for humanity takes Thérèse to a second stage of life, a capacity to abandon herself completely in the hands of a God and to live according to his terms and conditions. We are able to see even a historical and maybe psychological reason for its transition, of course, notwithstanding the interior growth and transformation that was taking place in Thérèse. On February 20, 1893, Sister Agnes, her second mother, became prioress. Psychologically, it was a new stage in Thérèse's life. The 5 years of suffering had ended. She writes that from now onwards, with love, not only did I advance, I actually flew. Spiritually also, she entered into a new stage. Already in October 1892, during her annual retreat, she understood that the exterior had been reduced to nothing by means of the trials of Cain. And now, Jesus invited her to work more intensely at interior detachment. She must totally humble that which could still be exalted in her own eyes. She confessed her new awareness. We shall never be able to carry out the follies he carried out for us. And our actions will never merit this name, for they are only very rational acts and much below what our love would like to accomplish. In a letter of July 6, 1893, for the first time in her writings, she used the noun abandonment, abandon, summarizing her new attitude. With this new attitude, the old concept of the need of suffering and one's own effort lost their prime importance. Instead, Thérèse sees the primacy of the need of a loving adherence to God. Not only adherence to the will of God, but above all to his divine action in Thérèse. She asserts, merit does not consist in giving much, but rather in receiving, in loving much. I no longer want to amass spiritual riches, but now to abandon my spiritual business to the Lord alone. In this letter to Celine, she writes, your Thérèse is not in the heights at this moment, but Jesus is teaching her to learn to draw profit from everything, from the good and the bad she finds in herself. He is teaching her to play at the bank of love, or rather, he plays for her and does not tell her how he goes about it, for that is his affair and not Thérèse's. What she must do is abandon herself, surrender herself without keeping anything, not even the joy of knowing how much the bank is returning to her. Jesus teaches me not to count up my acts. He teaches me to do all through love. But this is done in peace, in abandonment. It is Jesus who is doing all in me, and I am doing nothing. To Mary, she tells, my heart is full of the will of Jesus. Oh, if my soul were not already filled with this will, if it had to be filled by the feelings of joy and sadness which follow each other so quickly, it would be a tide of very bitter sorrow. But these alternatives do nothing but brush across my soul. I always remain in a profound peace which nothing can trouble. If the Lord offered me the choice, I would not choose anything. I want nothing but what He wants. It is what He does that I love. I acknowledge that it took me a long time to bring myself to this degree of abandonment. Now I have reached it, for the Lord took me and put me there. From that moment onwards, abandonment remained Therese's rule of conduct. She writes, I follow the way traced for me by Jesus. He wants me to practice abandonment like a little child, which does not worry about what others might do with him. She continues, I try to be no longer occupied with myself in anything, and I abandon to Him whatever He wants to accomplish in my soul. Another important aspect from the conception of abandonment that flows into the spirituality of little Thérèse is what we call today confidence. A manifestation and acceptance of one's own weakness and exaltation of the divine mercy in one's life. Now, this is another important realization that comes at this moment in Therese's life. That is, we are essentially being human in our weakness, in our human finitude. The more one strives to reach perfection, the more one realizes that we fall short of that perfection. The constant experience of our weakness on one side and the infinitude of our ideal of love on the other leads her to the keen sense of her own incompleteness. Saint Thérèse expresses it in one of her richest theological expressions. The more one advances in this way of perfection, the more one sees the goal is still far off. And now I'm simply resigned to seeing myself always imperfect, and in this I find my joy. However, instead of being intimidated or losing hope, Thérèse moves on to one of the most profound theological reality of Christian life, which she calls confidence. She realized the immensity of God's love for her and the great necessity of God's grace, which is her only harbor of salvation. Hereafter, she would go out of herself and explore the wonderful mercy in God's love. Therefore, Thérèse no longer expected any merits and progress from herself. Rather, she expected all merits and progress should come from God according to His will. Henceforth, she sought less to transform her weakness by herself than to let the Lord act in her on her behalf. She took account of the priority of God's love, which is not only the source of our acts of love, but also the source of our perfection. Isn't this already the way of spiritual childhood? Most certainly, This is already to live like a child of the Father. Nevertheless, it isn't yet the fullness of Theresa's little way. We must take the saint seriously when she states that at a given moment, and this would be only during the course of the autumn of 1894, she made her discovery of a little way totally new. Maybe it is good to express the little way totally new using the terminology of her letter of July 6, 1893. At that time, Thérèse wrote about a divine game in her journey towards sanctity. But she didn't yet understand how Jesus would go about increasing her love. At that moment of her discovery of the little way, the Lord revealed to her precisely how he goes about making his advance. Then Teresa was able to adapt herself perfectly to God's game. She saw a perfectly lighted path before her. Previously, she had been walking in a good way, but in obscurity, like a blind person, with all the hesitations, delays, and mistakes. How much faster and more confidently she would now run on a clear path. According to what Thérèse explains to us about her little way, totally new, her great discovery was centered on God, on the divine mercy, precisely as mercy. Of course, previously to this, Thérèse was also aware of the divine goodness and how helpful it was. But now she learned to recognize that God's love is not only real, first, and faithful, but that it is a love that descends towards the little, that seeks the little ones because they are little, and how great God is for the little. Littleness, instead of being principally humility, would from then on becomes principally confidence. Wanting to be little and to become more and more little, Thérèse earnestly desired, above all, a completely childlike confidence. What pleases God in my little soul, she later wrote, is that he sees me loving my littleness and my poverty, the blind hope that I have in his mercy. It is confidence and nothing but confidence that must lead us to love. In a clear and deliberate way, she entrusted herself to the grace working in her, cooperating with it, and surrendering to it. And therefore, this brings us to the crux of our problem that we are discussing today. What is that little way? And how finally Teresa came to realize this little way. Saint Thérèse would herself write this as the joy of being oneself totally in the arms of Jesus. The discovery of the little way, as we know, is only available for us in the manuscript C of her autobiography, written 3 months before her death. That Thérèse told to the world the discovery of her little way, a way that is very straight, very short, and totally new. She had noticed in comparing herself to the saints that on the one hand, she was like a grain of sand at the foot of a mountain. And on the other hand, that it is impossible for me to grow up. That is to say, to grow up all by herself. But that didn't mean that God couldn't make her grow. Thérèse began searching the scriptures for a solution, for an elevator that would lift her to the summit of the mountain of sanctity. Here we need to know that on September 14th, 1894, 1.5 months after Monsignor Martin's death, Celine herself was also consecrated to the Lord at the Carmel in Lisieux. Upon her entry, she carried with her a little notebook in which she had copied the most beautiful passages of the Old Testament. At that time, young Carmelites were not allowed to read the Old Testament in its entirety. Eager to grasp the Word of God, Thérèse plunged herself into Celine's notebook. It was there that she experienced her important eureka one day in the autumn of 1894. She was at first struck by these initial words. Whoever is a little one, let him come to me, taken from Proverbs 9:4. Here she felt that she was being addressed personally. Littleness was precisely her difficulty on the way to becoming a great saint. And there she was, being invited to approach God as a little one, even as a very little one. Guided by the Spirit, she pursued her search in a very personal and penetrating interpretation. Something stirred her in the reading of the promise of God. As one whom a mother caresses, so will I comfort you. You shall be carried at the breast, and upon the knees they shall caress you. Taken from Isaiah 66, verses 12 and 13. Let us pause for a moment. Thérèse cited this passage twice, and twice she revealed the emotion that it evoked in her. Here is what she said about, "Oh, never did words more tender and more melodious come to give joy to my soul." And again, after having listened to words such as these, there is nothing to do but to be silent and to weep with gratitude and love. Why such a deep emotion? Because for the very first time, Thérèse read in the Bible that God is like a mother to her child. And Thérèse was ultra sensitive to the love of a mother. Hadn't she lost her mother, matchless mother, to cancer when she was only 4 years and 8 months old? This brutal loss, at the age when a child has such a need for maternal affection to mold her personality, caused in Thérèse a deep trauma from which she only recovered at 14 with the grace of Christmas. Then after her mother's death, Thérèse became strongly attached to her sister Pauline, her second mother, who soon left for Carmel. It was a new tear at her heart when her other sister Marie, her third mother, so to speak, also left for the monastery. And there Thérèse, the orphan, read that God is like a mother for her very little child. Thus, she concluded, I had to remain little and become this more and more until she became a very little one, to be filled with God's motherly love. Her conclusion was clear. This little way, a way that is very straight, very short, which leads to the summit of love and sanctity. This elevator which I was searching for is your arms, O Jesus. Little Thérèse had finally discovered her little way. She had a gradual and evolving sense of it because she has in the depth of her soul that greatest treasure which God had given to her, the treasure of love. I think I and you, all of us, treasure the same gift in the depth of our soul. And therefore, she has discovered it, she has lived it, and she has reached the pinnacle of success. But the question before you and me is, how shall we make that little way ours by living it in our day-to-day lives? The answer is simple. That is by living out the four components of this little way perfectly in our lives. Number one, make love as the only ideal and the only way. Number two, learn to live a life mirroring the will of the Father. Number three, learn to accept your own weakness and frailty and exalt the divine mercy in your life. And finally, learn to live out in joy like a little child, being totally in the arms of Jesus, our God. God bless you.